Montana PBS presents the Montana Newspaper Association Candidate Debates, the 2014 race for the U.S. House. Support for this program provided by the Greater Montana Foundation, encouraging communications on issues, trends, and values of importance to Montanans, and the Montana Newspaper Foundation. From the Library Auditorium on the campus of Montana Tech in Butte, here is moderator Tom Egensberger.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to one of two debates featuring Montana's U.S. Senate and U.S. House candidates. I'm Tom Egensberger of the Montana Newspaper Association, which is jointly sponsoring these debates along with Montana PBS. I will serve as your moderator today. Up next are the candidates for the U.S. House, and we're going to get right down to business. John Lewis, the Democrat candidate, is a fourth-generation Montanan who went on to a career in public service. He worked for Senator Max Baucus, where he championed veterans' rights. Ryan Zinke, the Republican nominee, is from Whitefish and a graduate of the University of Oregon. He had a long career in the U.S. Navy as a SEAL before returning to Montana, where he was elected to the Montana Senate in 2008. Mike Fellows is the Libertarian Party candidate, and he is from Missoula. The questions for the House debate will be posed by a panel of media journalists in Montana. For this debate, they are Chuck Johnson, Chief of the Lee Newspaper's State Bureau in Helena, Anna Rao, an investigative journalist at Montana PBS, and Frank Mealy, the managing editor of the Kalispell Daily Interlake. The first question will come from Chuck Johnson and will go to Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Lewis, your former boss, Senator Max Baucus, was the chief congressional author of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Polls show the law is widely unpopular. What role, if any, did you play on the bill? And I'd like to ask you and the other candidates, what's your assessment of the law and what would you do to fix it?
Sure. Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Tom. I want to thank Montana Tech. It's great to be in Butte, America. It's exciting. And I want to thank the school for hosting this debate. I want to thank Senator Zinke and Mr. Fellows for their service and participating in this debate. I also want to recognize and thank my family that's in the crowd here, my wife, Melissa, and my two kids, Kate and Jackson. They've been with me every step of the way and couldn't do it without them. Look, as the father of two young kids, I want the same thing for my kids, for all of our kids, that I had growing up in Montana. I was born and raised in Montana. And whether it's good paying jobs, education, I want that for all of our kids. And I'm proud of my service to the state. It brought me to all corners. I got to help communities that work on, that were ravaged by floods, ravaged by wildfires, work on legislation to help veterans. But this race is about the future and who's got the best vision for the future. Look, in this country, we pay too much for health care. We can all agree on that. Healthcare costs are too high. And one of those reasons for that is because there are millions of Americans in this country uninsured that get healthcare, and those costs are spread around to the rest of us. And so what has happened? A law was passed, well-intentioned, to try to insure more Americans, bring down costs. Did it fix our healthcare system? No. But can we continue to improve on our healthcare system? Absolutely.
Mr. Zinke, your answer?
Well, I'm a combat veteran and not a community organizer, and I appreciate John's intent of the Obamacare, and I also understand you were an architect of it. But I choose my words carefully. I say abandon it. And as a naval officer, when you abandon a ship, you just don't jump in the ocean. What you do is you go to a different vessel. And with Obamacare, some of the problems we have is there are a couple good things. I mean, pre-existing conditions is a good thing, but more bad things because it took a bad system and made it worse. So when you look at how to make it better in Montana where it's rural, I think you're looking at things like co-ops for small businesses to make sure that we can pool. You look at tort reform, health savings accounts. There's a lot of tools that you can do to make healthcare accessible and affordable. Unfortunately, Obamacare makes it worse. So I do think there's a fix. And look, America's a fourth quarter country. I think I'm an optimist. I think we can rebuild her. I don't think that the best days are behind us. I think the best days are in front of us. But first of all, we have to be Americans first, and then look at the solutions on truth and find real solutions that make a difference. And I think they're out there. So there's a lot of tools you can do. Unfortunately, the construct of Obamacare as it sits is not constructive, and it makes access to health care worse.
Mr. Fellows, your answer?
Well, I want to first thank everybody for being here and the Montana Newspaper Association for inviting us. But I don't think Obamacare can work. As we've noticed before, it was over 100,000 page bill that nobody read. Nancy Pelosi said we had to pass this thing in order to see what was in it. But we need more free market ideas. I mean, for myself, I'd rather much have a cafeteria type plan where if I want to pay for the little things, I can do that. If I want to pay for the catastrophic insurance, well, I can do that as well. I'm part of a nonprofit organization, and our healthcare costs are going to go up $15,000 this year because the plan keeps on changing based on what Obamacare has in it. But there are some free market avenues for that. In Oklahoma, they have the Surgery Center of Oklahoma. When you go down there, if you have carpal tunnel, their charge for the surgery is probably only about $2,500. If you go to the hospital down the road with the administrators and all the bureaucratic mess, it's about $15,000. And so a lot of employers skip the insurance on some of that stuff, and they just pay for it short ways. And there's also things like Simple Care that are trying to get rid of insurance altogether and just take a fee for service. So there are some free market ideas that will work in this thing if we just look at them.
Mr. Lewis, your response?
Look, the fact of the matter is that thousands of Montanans are benefiting from the legislation, including kids who were denied health insurance because they had pre-existing conditions, seniors who were paying too much for prescription drugs because they were caught in what's called the Medicare prescription drug hole. Look, we need to continue to talk together. I'm somebody willing to work with both sides to continue to improve our healthcare system. And what are some ways that we can do it? Well, number one, we got to talk about healthcare again and be able to work with each other. Let's give states more flexibility to innovate and drive down the costs and increase coverage. You hear about the burden of paperwork. Let's reduce paperwork. Let's fix that. But what's not an option is holding 50 votes and to repeal and go back to what? We don't ever hear a solution to fix healthcare costs in this country and ensure more Americans from the other side. So I'm about solutions. Let's continue to fix our healthcare system and move forward, not backwards.
Mr. Zinke, your response?
Well, I do believe there are solutions out there. And I think looking at co-ops, again, for small businesses to pool, tort reform, making sure you have individual health savings accounts. There are a number of tools that are appropriate to make sure we have access to quality health care. Obamacare, unfortunately, is about billing. You're not given choice. There's no innovation. It penalizes prosthesis, for veterans. It penalizes, medical equipment. There's a lot of penalties in there, and so I do believe there are solutions, certainly better solutions than what we have. The unfortunate part is how Obamacare came to being. There was no Republican vote. It wasn't sitting down together and forming a healthcare system for America. We're the finest country in the world. We should have the best healthcare system. But it wasn't. It was a one-sided vote, and it was jammed through. So we talk about working together, but proof, is in doing it.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
I mean, I think healthcare in this country, at least Obamacare and Medicaid and Medicare, I think there's got to be a lot of things that we need to fix the system with. A friend of mine whose mother needed a walker, Medicare would pay $50 a month for the 2 or 3 years that she lived after she got it, but to get a walker would cost you about $50, and so that's money that we're wasting, I think, on health care itself. And of course, we can always blame the third-party payers, of course, the government, the insurance companies, obviously. And we saw what the health care costs in Massachusetts under Omnicare and under Tennessee back in 2000. The governor was thinking about instituting an income tax just to pay for health care, and so that's the problem. But we're always going to see the costs, and we've got to control those costs.
Thank you. The next question comes from Anna Rao, and we'll go to Mr. Zinke.
Mr. Zinke, the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court allows corporations, unions, and other groups to spend as much as they want to support or oppose a candidate as long as there's no coordination. This outside spending has exploded in the last 2 election cycles. According to the Federal Election Commission, outside groups spent over $26 million in the last election cycle in the Montana Senate race alone. This cycle, outside spending is approaching $1 million in the Senate race and is over $335,000 in the House race. Do you believe this is good for the election process and for our democracy?
Well, I don't believe the present system of outside money, influence that's hidden, is good for any democracy. The problem is, if you're going to stand behind, if you're going to donate to the parties, and both parties have it, if you're going to donate to organizations, then you need a name behind it. You need to make sure it's transparent. The money isn't as important as who stands by it. But when you have hidden, dark money, you can't tell where the donors are. You can't tell where it's from. And oftentimes, you can't even tell what country it's from. You know, that's the problem, is that Second Amendment, you know, freedom of speech, you know, our individual rights are enormously important. And we need to value those. But you look at transparency. Again, it doesn't matter to me, it isn't important the money. What's important to me is where it comes from. And if you have an individual that can't hold strong and put his name on it, then that's a corruptive force. And both parties have it. So what I'd like to see is transparency. If you're going to support a candidate, then have the Montana word behind it and put your name behind it.
Mr. Fellows, your answer?
Well, I don't see money as quite the problem as a lot of other people do. I think the reason we have so much money is because because these outside groups want the power to control, and they do that. We've seen that in various races across the country, especially in races like Michigan, where Justin Amish is running against a Chamber of Commerce-backed candidate, and they don't like the fact that he wants to get rid of some of these subsidies for businesses. And so you got that kind of stuff. I mean, a lot of us like to get together and pool our money so we can have the money, so we can have free speech, so we can talk about the issues. I mean, the problem with the power to control is that we've got to work to shrink government down to a small size so that we won't have these powerful outside interests. And when you look at some of the contributions from my competitors in this race, I mean, John Lewis has got a lot of candidates, or a lot of contributions coming in from Act Blue. Mr. Zinke has a lot of outside contributions outside of the state of Montana, so those are all influencing, and sometimes I think you'll have the best money candidates so by in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Lewis, your answer?
There's too much money in politics, period. Everywhere you go in Montana, people agree with that, and it's been made much worse by the Citizens United decision, the McCutcheon decision, that's created more money in politics. Anna said it, $26 million of outside money spent in our state in the last election. That's disgusting, trying to influence and tell Montanans how to vote. And so we need less money in politics. This is the source of the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. This is why people are not working together and doing what they're sent there to do, which is solve tough issues, make tough decisions, work on solutions. Instead, it's about money and raising money. There's too much money in politics, period.
Mr. Zinke, your response?
Well, I certainly would not be known as a Washington insider on there. I'm third generation Montanan and served my country 23 years. And I can tell you that money drives message. And that's the cold cold facts of it. But it can be changed. Again, it's about transparency, because I want to know who is actually behind the money. Doesn't matter whether you're a billionaire or worker at a dime store. What matters to me is that you're going to support a candidate and you're going to have your name behind it. You know, no more dark phantoms that come in and manipulate. And I think that's the corruptive force that's killing our country.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
Well, we all know that money buys influence, but money doesn't guarantee elections. We all know that the Koch brothers spent $400 million to get Mitt Romney elected, and that didn't work. We've seen Eric Cantor, who spent $5 million, and he actually spent more money, $160-some thousand on steak dinners than his competitor did, and he still lost by 10 percentage points. So money is not the end all, but for small candidates like myself, money is, in effect, free speech, because to get my views out, I can stand on a corner and talk to 3 or 4 people, but throwing ads on TV, I can reach a whole different audience, and all it takes is money and donations and volunteers.
Mr. Lewis, your response?
Well, look, The beauty of Montana is this is still a retail state. People want to meet you, shake your hand, size you up, see where you stand. And so that's what I'm going to be focused on in this election, regardless of the outside money that comes in the state. But we've got to do something about the political system so that we can get people working together again on solutions and move this country forward.
The next question comes from Frank Mealy, and we'll go to Mr. Fellows.
Mr. Fellows, President Obama has famously declared that if Congress won't do what he wants, that he will get things done with his phone and his pen. That seems to include changing laws such as Obamacare, creating laws such as the DREAM Act, and ignoring laws such as the Defense of Marriage Act. Is this a crisis or just business as usual? Can Congress force the executive branch to enforce existing laws and to prevent the president from legislating with his pen? And if so, how?
It's going to have to be Congress that finally steps up to solve this problem. I mean, there's all kinds of different laws that the president signs, and the prison release in Afghanistan was one such law that he signed a law that specifically said that he would notify Congress 30 days before any such prisoner transaction were to take place. But then he decided that he didn't like that law, so he was going to do his own thing. I think that's one of the problems we see with Obama, plus all the executive orders that he's written that overrides Congress. We have a Constitution, and we should apply the Constitution to those things and make sure that Congress follows its own rules and make sure that the president also follows its rules as well.
Mr. Lewis, your answer?
Frank, your point is a direct result of Congress's inability to do its job and do the job of the country, work together and find answers to this stuff. And I see a real rural-urban divide in Congress and in Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, when Congress is just paralyzed and not doing anything, then unelected bureaucrats in D.C. make decisions about what happens in rural America. And places like Montana pay the biggest price of that. And that's when you see cuts to things like Amtrak and essential air service and different things that we depend on in Montana. And we need an advocate at the table for rural America. And Congress has got to get its act together and solve these issues so that the executive branch isn't making all the decisions for rural America.
Mr. Zinke, your answer?
Well, John, I'm going to disagree with you a little. I don't think there's any justification whatsoever for the abuse of power, and what I think is the dismantling of American power, both domestically and abroad, by this president. I think when you ask the question, do you trust the United States government? Ask that question now and go back to Ronald Reagan, whether you trusted America. Now listen, I've fought in a lot of countries, and I've seen what happens when a people no longer trust their government. The United States is pretty close. I mean, I want to see accountability back. I want to see stop the abuse of executive overreach. I do want to see Congress work harder and smarter to make sure we honor individual freedoms, honor our Constitution, and bring government back to where it should be. Government should be working for us. We are the people. We are the people that the government has to be accountable to. But when the government decides by executive power to abuse, to harass, to spy, and the list goes on, then the government's out of control. But I'm an optimist. I think it can be fixed. Because it isn't the Cold War we face, it isn't the Russians, it isn't the Chinese, it's us. We did it. We allowed it to happen, and certainly I think we're strong enough to fix it.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
Well, I think John Lewis talks about the unelected bureaucrats. Well, that's one of the problems that we have in Congress today, is that they simply pass laws, and then it's the bureaucrats that tell us what the laws are supposed to be. And you see them in the Federal Register, and once they become law, then we figure out, or finally find out what these laws actually say from what they eventually passed. And plus, you got to figure that the American public, I think, likes the fact that we have gridlock in some cases, especially in Capitol Hill and between the president, because if nothing is done, then they can't tax us any further, they can't pass laws against us, and they can't really screw us over, because what has Congress done in the last 6-7 years? Really nothing. And before that, it was increased deficits, increased spending, giving handouts to special interests, And so is that the kind of Congress we want? No, I don't think, or a president.
Mr. Lewis, your response?
Well, top-down solutions, one-size-fits-all solutions from bureaucrats in D.C. don't work well for Montana. We need Montana solutions. Mike said it, Congress passes laws, and then Congress can get together and improve them and improve upon what they're doing. And so we need less politics. We need to focus on what is best for Montana, and that's what I'm about. We know better how to solve issues important to Montana here at home than somebody in the executive branch in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Zinke, your response?
Well, I concur. One size doesn't fit all. And clearly the view of the Potomac's a lot different than the view of the Missouri and Fort Benton. And that's a lot of the problems we face in Montana is we do things a little differently. We're independent. We're self-reliant. We're value-based. And Montanans need to stand together and go, enough. You know, the Forest Service should not be carrying tasers and sidearms and attack dogs. When I grew up in Montana, I can tell you the Forest Service had an old truck and a bucket of shovel. And that's what the Forest Service should have. There's 73 agencies that have SWAT-like groups in the agency. I think the Postal Service has one. Why? This needs to be addressed because, again, it goes back to trust. Is the American people have to trust their government. I want to trust my president. When my president gives a State of the Union address, I want to say, yes, it's truthful. And right now, I'm not getting that. And we need to hold everyone accountable, Congress and the executive.
The next question comes from Anna Rao and will go to Mr. Lewis.
Speaking of the Forest Service, Mr. Lewis, the federal government owns large chunks of lands in the West, including 28% of the land in Montana. There's an effort underway in several Western states to force the U.S. government to turn land ownership over to the states. As a first step in Montana, a legislative interim committee is exploring how the feds manage Montana land for wildfires, motorized recreation, drilling, and mining. Those who favor state ownership of federal lands say the state would do a better job of managing them for recreation and for profit, while those who oppose the movement say this is really about circumventing the EPA, allowing for easier extraction, and eventually privatizing public lands. Where do you stand on this issue?
Well, thank you, Anna. Our public lands in Montana are part of our way of life, and people are in Montana because they want to be, and it's outdoors. We've got the highest percentage of hunting licenses in the country, highest percentage of fishing licenses in the country, and our public lands play a big part of that. And it's also part of our economy. $6 billion industry, people using our public lands. And the idea of transferring those lands to the state is a terrible idea and will result in a sell-off of our public lands to the highest bidder. And I do not support that in any shape or form. And also, begs the question is who's going to manage those public lands? We're paying 3 times as much in firefighting costs right now than we paid in the 90s in this country. And we need help to do that. And so, look, this is about our outdoor heritage. This is about our way of life. It is not a good idea to transfer the control of public lands, which will result in a sell-off to the highest bidder.
Mr. Zinke, your answer?
Well, I don't think there's any question that Montana can manage our lands better than Washington. And the problem is, how do you stop the lawsuits that are preventing Montana to have multiple use? I mean, I grew up, you know, and graduated high school in Whitefish, and I remember where Libby was AA. Today they're B. There's a mine that they've been waiting for 2 years for an EIS. It should have been an environmental assessment, and yet the Forest Service doesn't approve it. Why? That's 600 jobs in Lincoln County. And you want to talk about despair in Montana? Go to Lincoln County. So there's a contrast in the candidates. My #1 priority is opening that mine because it means a lot to Libby. John's #1 priority is to preserve the North Fork. My #1 donor, you know, was Tommy Nunes from Oasis Oil because he believes this energy equivalent, our energy capability in this country, we can be energy independent in 5 years. John's was Jim Messina, who's from Butte, and Nancy Pelosi. So there's a difference between the candidates. There's a difference in philosophies. I think multiple use is important in our forest. We need to get access back. Sustained yield, you want to talk about sustained yield in Lincoln County? Sustained yield is around 300 million board feet, and they can't even get 10 million out. So I'm concerned, but I think Montana
Mr.
can
Zinke,
manage
your time
along.
is up.
Thank you.
Mr. Fellows, your answer, please.
It'll be nice to have Montana manage its own lands. It'd be nice to bring some of those federal lands into Montana control. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but when you look at the federal debt at 17 trillion, we're going to have to look at some of our assets and see which lands that are important to us and which lands that are not intrinsic, that don't have really intrinsic value. I mean, there was one think tank in Bozeman that talked about a small parking lot in Oregon that was a national forest, and we got Forest Service places in California where there's no forest, and so I think it's the decisions about Montana can be best made by Montanans, not some faceless bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. And plus, I think we've got to get more of the nonprofits like the Nature Conservatory, the Rocky Mountain Health Foundations. Let them go ahead and buy this land. Let them manage it. I mean, I think the federal government and Montana, we have plenty of land, and of course, us as consumers, we don't want to get locked out. We want to be able to use the land for our own uses. But plus, nobody really, I think, can agree upon which tracts of lands do we agree upon that will be wilderness and ones that we're going to use for timber and mining and so on and so forth.
Mr. Lewis, your response.
Look, we can manage our lands better. There's no question about that. I don't know if it's going to take arming Forest Service folks with tasers, as we heard about here. I've never heard of that before. But this is about our outdoor heritage, our way of life. And I'm proud of the support I've received all across Montana. I've received a donation from all 56 counties. This is a Montana-based campaign, not a California campaign. And it's not surprising. I heard Nancy Pelosi mentioned. Nancy Pelosi's not involved in this campaign, and as much time as Mr. Zinke spends in California at his home, it's no wonder he thinks Nancy Pelosi's involved in this campaign.
Good. Hold
It's
your
not
applause,
a California
please.
campaign. This is a Montana campaign.
Mr. Zinke, your response.
The address is 409 West 2nd Street, Whitefish. Now, but I like you, John. But getting back to the question is, look, the Forest Service, the number one budget expenditure in the Forest Service is fighting fires. Number 2 is litigation, and number 3 is management. Can they do better? Absolutely. I think the looking at it is stop the perpetual lawsuits. If you're an out-of-state entity, you don't have standing in Montana to sue, because what's happening is that the timber companies, the mining companies, the people that want to use the land, our public land, can't get to it. So there's a better way to do it. Let's stop the lawsuits, and so we can go back to multiple use management for the benefit of everybody. Public land is ours. It's all of ours. And all of us should be able to use it.
Mr. Fellows, your response.
Well, you have to realize that there is a cost to owning land. Certainly we have to pay taxes on some of that, the federal government, the upkeep, and that kind of situations. But when Plum Creek decided to get rid of some of their lands and the Nature Conservatory decided to purchase some of the lands, I was all for it, but then again, they decided to make a profit and sell it back to the government, which I didn't think was necessary. I thought if they wanted to save it, they should go ahead and take care of it and show the world that they can do it. And when you look at cities like Missoula, well, we had to save Mountain Jumbo, which is virtually, I guess, a vertical cliff from development. Well, we weren't going to see development there anyway, but certainly we had to spend money to save it. And so I think we got to look at our land purchases, and if we're going to buy land, let's look at the ones that are going to benefit us and not benefit just the very few.
The next question comes from Frank Mealy and will go to Mr. Zinke.
Various senators and 2 presidents have been, for the past decade, proposing some kind of immigration reform. President Obama seems to be stepping up the pressure on Congress by slowing down enforcement of border security and in some cases halting customs procedures that allow for arrest and deportation of illegal immigrants. Do you believe that the United States has an obligation to accept as legal residents of our country those people who arrived illegally, or would you work on legislation that would force the president to enforce existing laws such as E-Verify that would make it difficult or impossible for illegal immigrants to get work, thus encouraging them to return to their countries of origin?
Well, immigration present policy isn't working, is it? You've seen the news recently, thousands of kids coming across. What are you going to do with them? So I think the answer is we've got to secure the border, especially if you're a landowner in Texas and some of the border states. You don't have access and use of your land. In the United States, as a government, is not supporting your property rights. So I do think you need to shut the border down. Work visas for people that are legal here, yeah, it makes sense to me. There's about 6 million immigrants who would go back and forth. They're held here because they don't want to go back and forth in fear they'll get picked up. So work visas are appropriate, but also is that I think we should speak English. As a one nation under God, a unifying message is our language, and we have to be able to talk to each other. We have to communicate. We have to articulate and argue. And so speaking English is important. Lastly, if you serve your military, and as a former commander, I can tell you I had a lot of people that I fought with and served with that weren't U.S. citizens. In the Philippines, Poland. I think if you serve your military, our military, then I think you should go to the head of the line. It's not amnesty, it's earned citizenship.
Mr. Fellows, your answer?
Well, we had some major immigration reform back in '86 under the Reagan administration. We just need to follow the laws on the books with regards to allowing people to come into this country. I mean, those immigrants just want a better life for themselves and their families. If we could find a way to improve the country's economy in, say, Mexico and Guatemala and some of those Central American countries where they're coming up, we certainly could invariably stop some of the flow of immigrants coming to the United States. But they want to come to the United States because they want the land of the free, and they want to improve their well-being for not only for themselves but their families. And somebody once mentioned the fact that we've got a lot of people in this country that really don't want to work, that would love to just sit around and collect welfare, and we've got people coming in this country that would love to work, and especially some of those ones where we actually need their experience with computer science and some of the other things that we should be allowing in this country anyway, because if we need the experience, and certainly it would benefit us and benefit some of these companies in the United States. And so there's things we can do, but right now we do have laws on the books, and let's follow them.
Mr. Lewis, your answer?
We're a nation of immigrants, and each new wave of immigrants throughout our history has helped advance our country. And we do have a problem. We have 11 million undocumented workers in this country, and we need to do something about that. But we shouldn't punish kids of those here illegally. We've got to do it the right way. And this is one of those tough issues that it's going to take both sides coming together and coming up with a solution to fix it and enforce our current laws and to fix the system. Can's been kicked down the road for many, many years. It's been too long since we've had an overhaul of our immigration system, and it's time to attack the issue, and I'm willing to try.
Mr. Zinke, your response?
Well, John, I appreciate you asking about my family, but for the record, is that I do not own property in Santa Barbara. My mother-in-law does, former consul to Peru under Eisenhower, who's suffering from an illness. And so because my wife is the only child, my wife spends a lot of time there in Santa Barbara. So I think it's the right thing to do as a family. So just for the record. Immigration, we need to fix it. Because at present, the laws, no one knows what they are. I have good friends at Customs, I have good friends at the border, I have good friends across the spectrum, and no one understands what the law is. And that needs to be fixed. The law of the land should be appropriate, it should be enforced. So yes, can both sides get together and form an immigration policy that makes sense? Absolutely, and it needs to be done.
Mr. Fellows, your response.
Well, I think some of our problems, too, stem from the fact that we have this sort of welfare welcome wagon at the border. But I think some of the other troubles we're going to have is some of these people that have been here 15, 20 years that have already established a job, they've already bought a house, they've already had their children anchor babies. We can't just automatically it's going to be tough to uproot some of these families that are being productive citizens in this country, that are paying taxes, that are owning property. And so we got to look at some of those things as well. So sometimes we almost have to look at these things as a case-by-case basis when it comes to who we're going to send back because of their illegal status.
Mr. Lewis, your response.
Again, we need to enforce the laws we have, improve the system, and this is also about growing the economy as well. And we've got to find a solution that I think to our immigration problems that can grow the economy in terms of growing our workforce and contributing to things that benefit us all, like Medicare, Social Security. So let's find a solution to it. And again, I come back to this tough issue that Congress has to be willing to start the conversation, work together. Both sides have proposed solutions and it's gone nowhere. So we need to get some movement on fixing our system.
The next question comes from Chuck Johnson, and we'll go to Mr. Fellows.
Mr. Fellows, if federal funds aren't found by August, the money that's sent to the states for highway construction and bridge construction by the federal government will be postponed, delaying projects. House Republican leadership recently suggested cutting Saturday mail delivery and using that money for the highway funding. Do you agree or disagree, or how would you come up with the federal highway funds?
Well, I would have to disagree with that notion. We have the Highway Trust Fund, and the problem with the Highway Trust Fund in the old days, they didn't spend more than they didn't spend more than they had. So even if projects had to take a little longer, they still got done. Of course, nowadays we're overspending, and that's the trouble with Congress. They're using a lot of different funds to pay for the highway construction projects when the Highway Trust Fund, through our gas taxes, is supposed to pay for all this. And that's one of their few suggestions I guess they have is say, well, what we're going to do is cut Saturday delivery to pay for the Highway Trust Fund. A lot of Montanans aren't going to accept that notion that they're going to lose Saturday delivery just because Congress wants to spend more money, and I would certainly object to that. And if elected to Congress, would vote against that proposal.
Mr. Lewis, your answer?
We're a highway state. Highways are lifeblood. If you travel all over all 56 counties, you realize just how important infrastructure is to this state. And we can't have economic development and continue to grow our economy in Montana without infrastructure. And so we need an investment in infrastructure in Montana. And many of our bridges are failing. Highways, I've known from personal experience driving on them that need improvement. And so we've got to find a solution to the Highway Trust Fund. I don't support ending Saturday delivery. That's another idea in Washington that hurts rural America. Seniors that live in some of the small towns I've been to depend on that Saturday delivery. And it could be prescription drugs in the wintertime. So we've got to find a solution. We've got to invest in infrastructure, and highways are one of them. So,
Mr. Zinke, your answer?
Well, I don't think it's an either-or answer. A country that doesn't invest in the future, suffers in the present. And you look at Montana, and try to get cell phone coverage between our cities. There's better cell phone coverage in Iraq today in a civil war than there is in Montana. Our highways, we're probably $500 million behind if you add up what's in the Red Book. So how do we get there? We'll go back to bureaucracy. If you like statistics, in 1 year alone, 2012, unelected bureaucrats, through rules, we're talking Sarbanes-Oxley if you're corporate, or Dodd-Frank in banking, inflicted about $3.6 trillion of damage on business. Trillion. That's roughly equivalent to our budget for 1 year. So investment, is there dollars for investment? Absolutely. But we got to get government out of business to grow the economy. You can cut some, maybe 10%. Can't tax anymore. The way out of our problems in this country is to grow the economy, create jobs, and energy independence.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
Well, I think sometimes, too, the highway bills include too many pork projects. I can remember the highway bill in 2005 that was spending massive amounts of money with the Republican majority in Congress, and George Bush threatened to veto that bill if they didn't get their spending down. But there was over 400 and close to 500 different add-ons to that bill that dealt with things that weren't necessarily related to infrastructure, to highways. You had the Harley-Davidson Museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You've got the BUTTE Museum somewhere. These are things that shouldn't be in the highway bill at all. And when you look at things in Montana, we spent over $1 million for an access roads from Giant Springs State Park to the main road. And so that's the kind of stuff that we spend money on. And so we got to prioritize where our essentials are.
Mr. Lewis, your response?
Well, I agree we need to get government out of business. But when it comes to infrastructure and highways, we need help. And here's one way the private sector can help. Corporations have over $2 trillion in accounts overseas. Let's encourage corporations to invest in America and encourage them to purchase infrastructure bonds to help pay for highways and infrastructure in this country and help solve the Highway Trust Fund crisis.
Mr. Zinke, your response?
Well, I agree that we should encourage corporations to come back to America. Let's come back. Let's make our energy program, the barriers to business, let's lower them so you can make a profit. And profit's not a dirty word. Profit allows good wages. It allows benefits. Think about 20 years ago in a business in Montana. 20 years ago, wages were higher. You could get a job, a 40-hour work week that actually had benefits. In Montana, it's not so. So it is about getting government out of business, lowering the barriers so we can grow the economy and energy independence. And if we become energy independent, which we can in 5 years, we can bring back manufacturing, particularly in the natural gas. I'm an optimist. I think we can do it.
The next question comes from Frank Mealy, and we'll go to Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Lewis, is there any aspect of life that Congress should not have power to control legislatively? Do you think the General Welfare Clause of the U.S. Constitution empowers Congress to do anything it wants, or would you promote a more restrictive approach to federal power, especially as we have spent $17 trillion we don't have?
Well, when it comes to people's personal lives, people want to make their decisions and live freely the way that they want to. And so that's not a role for the federal government. Healthcare, personal healthcare decisions are between a woman, her family, her doctor, and her faith, period. So there are many areas that there isn't a role for the federal government. The federal government shouldn't be spying on law-abiding citizens in this country. People are, and I come back to say that people are in Montana because they want to be in Montana, and it's our way of life. It's the freedom we have here. People should be able to live that free life that we have. And so, yeah, there are many, many areas, Frank, where the federal government does not have a proper role.
Mr. Zinke, your answer?
I agree. It is about limited government, and our Constitution needs to be honored, individual rights. And that's what a Constitution is about. It's about individual rights and not collective rights. So it should be a limited government. And I think that's what we're fighting, is Washington, one size fits all, Washington solutions. They don't make sense in Montana. And we should push back. And pushing back is Congress needs to limit the scope and mission of our government agencies. I'm not anti-government. What I am is good government. And good government is small. It understands who the boss is, we the people. And the missions and role and scope are limited. You know, there's an old saying in Montana is that, government stops the mailbox. It's true, because that's Montana. Montana is self-reliant, independent, and we don't want government in our lives. and I support that 100%. There is a compelling interest in government when it comes to the elderly, the children, the young, those that can't defend themselves. And so there, as a society, as a responsible society, there's a compelling interest to make sure we do the right thing for those that can't defend for themselves.
Mr. Fellows, your answer?
Well, the founders set up our Constitution and the Bill of Rights simply to limit government. Those are the things that we were going to have. Those are the things that we're going to limit the government. Congress shall make no laws. But a lot of people in the two major parties, when they talk about limited government, what they're actually saying is we want it limited to what the government spent yesterday, or we want it limited to what we're going to spend tomorrow. But Congress actually wanted a small, limited government that its only services was to protect your life, liberty, and start out being property, because property is very important to our founding fathers, that I own my own self, and so therefore I can make my own decisions, and I make my own decisions better than those folks in Washington, D.C., or I make my decisions better than those folks in Helena, Montana. And that's what we need more of, individual rights. Sometimes I see candidates that talk about freedom and liberty, but it's more like George Orwell's Animal Farm. Yes, I believe in freedom, but I believe in the notion that we will have freedom, but some will have more freedom than others.
Mr. Lewis, your response?
What we need from the federal government is certainty. And what we see from Congress is they go from crisis to crisis to crisis, whether it's the debt limit, fiscal cliff, government shutdown. And so we need certainty for small businesses in this country. We need certainty for farmers and ranchers. We've had severe drought, wildfires. Farmers and ranchers don't need more uncertainty than they already face from Congress. And so that's what I'd like to see the federal government focus on, is solutions to give certainty to people that work for a living.
Mr. Zinke?
Well, I think it's time for more leadership and less politics in D.C. You know, quite frankly, it doesn't matter to me whether you're Republican or Democrat or conservative or libertarian or Tea Party. What matters to me is you're American and you care about the country. And you care that we make solutions that will make sure that we can rebuild her. I don't want to see America destroyed. None of us do. I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe that America has a role overseas to show leadership by example. I mean that. As your next congressman, I'll fight every day to ensure it.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
I think the government's gotten too big. We've gotten a lot of overreach, and the one example was probably a couple of examples I'd like to point out, but in the Supreme Court case versus Rice, I believe, in California, Clarence Thomas got it right because it was a case where an individual using medical marijuana, and the feds jumped in and said, well, no, it's under our jurisdiction. But Clarence Thomas got it right because he essentially pointed out that the marijuana was growing in California. It didn't leave the state, so the federal government had no business being there. And recently, we passed the Montana Firearms Act in the Montana legislature, where if the firearm was made in Montana, produced in Montana, the feds wouldn't have any business regulating that product in Montana. I supported that law, and I think we got to get the feds at us some of those things where it doesn't belong.
The next question comes from Chuck Johnson, and we'll go to Mr. Zinke.
Mr. Zinke, almost every week, it seems, somewhere in this country, a disturbed young man opens fire and kills a number of people before he eventually kills himself or is killed by law enforcement. What, if anything, do you think Congress should do to help try to prevent these tragedies?
That's a tough question, Chuck. It is about the Second Amendment. You know, I was criticized in the primary for being, Ryan Zinke's not pro-gun. I'm a former Navy SEAL commander. I believe in guns. I believe our legacy is to own a gun. I'm firmly against, I'd have been to, I think, every gun show, around Montana. I'm firmly against, changing the rules we have in Montana. Because I think the rules we have are appropriate, all of them. I stood up against the NRA about trying to come into Montana and change the Fish, Wildlife and Parks rule on Montanans controlling our ammunition and weapons for hunting. So I think it's a Montana issue. And I love the NRA, and I'm a member, but I don't work for the NRA. I work for Montana. And so, you know, the weapons and guns, I think better education, you know, make sure that the parents keep them locked up at home. You know, certainly in guns in schools, that should be up to WINET and the local school boards. You know, I grew up when there was a rifle rack, you know, in the parking lots. It isn't appropriate every place, and I think the local school board should make that call. So I'm a defender of our Second Amendment, especially in Montana, because that's our legacy.
Mr. Fellows, your answer?
Well, I do support the Second Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Second Amendment is really not about hunting. It's about the fact that we just had fought a war back in the founding fathers' days against a militia, namely the English military. And so, and it continues today to protect our rights, our property, our families. We have the right to keep and bear arms because in case the government gets too tyrannical, we may need that again. You know, and I'm against a lot of these laws that they have in Congress. You know, background checks are nice, but it could be lead up to gun registration, which I think privacy issues. I think we have a right to own firearms, and I don't think it's any of the government's business what kind or what type we obviously own. And when you got John McCain out there, who got a C rating from the NRA talking about, well, we need to close loopholes at gun shows, I think that's wrong. I think in some cases I've heard that Ryan Zinke is more of a John McCain type person in the issue of guns, because when you support gun rights, you support gun rights wholeheartedly, and there shall be no compromise as far as I'm concerned with the rights to our Second Amendment.
Mr. Lewis, your answer?
I strongly support the Second Amendment and the right of citizens to bear arms. What happened in Connecticut and Colorado is national tragedy, and as father of 2 young kids, I can't even imagine the pain. And my first question is, what would cause somebody to turn a gun on innocent children? So I think the first thing we should do is address how we treat mental health care in this country. And clearly, we're not doing a good enough job of that. So that's where we should start.
Mr. Zinke, a response?
Well, it's interesting on a campaign. There's a lot. I should add the top 10 rumors about Ryan Zinke. I think probably the best one was my wife at 23 years was a Israeli Mossad, and she was my mistress. So I think that's probably the top 10 of the rumors. But I'm strongly Second Amendment. You know, I grew up in Montana. I think you should have the right to own a weapon. There are limitations. I don't think you need a howitzer, and I don't think you need a Gustav shoulder-fired weapon. But a 50 cal, knock yourself out.
Mr. Fellows, response?
Well, I think I'm not much for having to apply for a right that I already have and concealed carry, but for the most part, if the sensible thing might be in terms of that is to make my concealed carry permit accessible in other states. I know when Florida decided to approve a concealed carry permit in their state, violent crime went down, because if I'm a criminal, I'm not going to try to rob or steal somebody because my life is important as well. You know, is it worth getting shot for $5 at a convenience store? I don't think so. So we do have to protect the Second Amendment, and there are those people that want to destroy it, and I will protect it.
Mr. Lewis, response?
Look, it comes with the responsibility. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and we need to enforce the laws that are on the books and improve the system if needed and address mental health care in this country.
Okay, the next question is from Anna Rao and would go to Mr. Fellows.
Mr. Fellows, polling by Gallup and the Pew Research Center, among others, shows a strong majority of Americans support raising the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10 per hour. Do you believe the minimum wage should be increased, and why or why not?
Well, it gets to be kind of a complicated question in some cases, because it's nice to say that we all support our friends and neighbors having increased minimum wage. You know, I've been on the board of directors for a local union in Missoula, and sometimes you don't look at the consequences, because when we raise the minimum wage, obviously the cost of businesses go up as well. And so if you're willing to pay, you know, $25 for a hamburger at McDonald's, then maybe they're going to be willing to pay their employees $15 to $20 an hour. But there are consequences. Bill Gates has talked about consequences of raising the minimum wage, because once you start raising minimum wage, then businesses are going to find other ways to replace employees with technology. McDonald's is now doing this now in Europe, where they're replacing the person at the front counter with touchscreens. So you can order a touchscreen, swipe your credit card. Applebee's is doing this. You see people in stores like JCPenney's now, I guess they're using iPads, so you can go down, you can get what you want, have the employee swipe your card, buy it on the spot. You know, those are the kinds of things that eliminate people. And so, you know, we've got to look at the consequences of raising the minimum wage in that context.
Your answer, Mr. Lewis?
I do support it, and here's why. As you travel across the state of Montana, many folks are working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. And 2/3 of those that make minimum wage in this country are women. And so, look, we need to support small businesses in this state, and the good news is most small businesses in Montana offer above the minimum wage. And studies show that when you increase workers' take-home pay, they spend it in the economy, the local economy. Someone goes down to Bob Ward's and buys another fishing pole or a four-wheeler. And so, absolutely, I support it because we need a living wage in this country.
Your answer, Mr. Zinke?
Well, I'm against it. I guess that's a pretty clear contrast. And it's because, at the end, it hurts the people that need it the most. Because minimum wage, and I've toured around Montana a lot. You know, there's 500 homeless high school kids in Montana. I'm sorry, in Billings alone. 500 homeless high school kids in Billings. Billings is the #1 economy in the state. So why? Because you're right, John. It is about jobs. But the statistics and the facts will show that minimum wage hurts those that need it the most. And Washington is not going to solve our problems. If we want a minimum wage in Montana, let Montanans talk about it. But I don't want Washington making a decision about minimum wage, what it should be in Montana. At the heart of the issue is making better jobs in Montana. You know, service industry jobs, we talk about Medicare, Medicaid, and all this, the public subsidy going to those that need it the most. You know why? Because Montana's poor. We're 49th out of 50. And a lot of because of the jobs are service industry jobs. We need a greater diversity of jobs. We need job growth in the technology side. We need job growth in the union side, non-union side. We need job growth where the prosperous economy can make it, where all of us can prosper. So minimum wage, I don't think it does any good. I think it hurts.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
Well, I think another way certainly to bring more wages to people would be to have a smaller government, because obviously we're paying so much in taxes. If you had an extra $2,000 a year because you were paying less in taxes, what would you spend that money on? I know in Missoula, we keep upping the taxes on people's properties, and to the fact that it's getting really more of a high place to live. And so the average middle class person can't live in Missoula because of some of these higher taxes. And so if we shrunk government and kept it, just funded the essential government services, we could certainly cut our taxes. That'd give us more spending income, and then we wouldn't have to work 2 jobs just to pay the taxes, just to pay the mortgage and to pay the government.
Mr. Lewis, a response?
Look, I'm for increasing pay for working people here in Montana. And I come back to what I said. Many folks in Montana are working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. And so I can't see why not increasing pay for working families like that isn't going to help them in their lives, and they will spend that money in the economy in Montana. So I support it.
Thank you. And Mr. Zinke, your response?
Well, a lot of people are doing 2 or 3 jobs. And try to find a 40-hour worker if you're a single mom with benefits in Montana. You know, why? Isn't it because the small business doesn't like to pay a great wage? Because they can't afford to. Because the compliance measures are out of control. So again, does increasing the minimum wage, is that going to fix the problem? No. We need a more diverse economy, a better economy. We need to focus on what Montana can do well. We can manufacture. We can use our resources. We can get in the woods again and log. We can be an energy exporter. We can be value added in our commodities. You know, beef prices are good. I was in Miles City last night. The cattlemen are pretty happy, but they're really worried about the water. They're really worried about government oversight on things that matter to them. So it's a bigger question than minimum wage is how to get good jobs in Montana so we don't need to be at the bottom.
The next question will come from Chuck Johnson, and we'll go to Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Lewis, most candidates have been saying they want to cut the federal budget and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. Yet Montana receives about $1.92 back from the federal government for every dollar we pay in federal taxes, 8th highest among the states. What 3 federal programs affecting Montana are you willing to propose cutting or eliminating?
Well, everyone agrees that we've got to do something to address the deficit in this country, but it's also about priorities. And there are proposals in Congress right now, the Ryan budget, for instance, that puts a big red target on working folks and turns Medicare into a voucher system. 1 in 5 Montanans uses the benefits of Medicare and Social Security, including my own parents. So we need to improve those programs, but we need to look for ways that we can cut out wasteful spending. The federal government owns 80,000 unused buildings. Surely they can sell off some of those and save there. They have a fleet of cars of 600,000 vehicles. We have 5 military bases in Europe alone. There are areas that we can make cuts in this country, and I come back to it's about priorities. And the budget, the Ryan budget being proposed in Congress right now, it puts a red target on rural America. Cuts to Amtrak, cuts to Essential Air Service, cuts Saturday delivery, cuts to Pell Grants. Over half of college students in this country, or in Montana, use Pell Grants. Cuts to Head Start. 500 less kids in Montana would have access to Head Start if the Ryan budget became law. So it's about priorities. We've got to cut out wasteful spending and attack the deficit in this country.
Mr. Zinke, your answer?
Well, I think we can start with the 73 agencies that have SWAT-like groups. We can cut those. And the Ryan budget, yeah, I think the Ryan budget actually is a pretty good framework. It's not perfect, and I'll agree. You know, Medicare is an issue, but Medicare should have been addressed when we shuffled over $700 billion from Medicare into the Obama account. So I think we need to keep our promises to our elderly, particularly in the Medicare and veterans benefits. That's a promise that a great nation made, and we need to keep those promises. But the Ryan budget as a framework, it balances the budget in 10 years. It balances the budget in 10 years. And we didn't get in the problems we got overnight. So for some, it's probably not as aggressive as it should be. I guess that's my politics. Because if you're on the far left, I'm just way too conservative for you. If you're on the far right, I'm probably not conservative enough. But for Montana, I think I'm just about right. I read the bills, I listen. I try to forward the best policies in the best interest of our nation and the best interest of Montana, always. Again, I'm an optimist. I think we can produce a budget that values our commitments, that keeps our promises, and balances the budget, because that's what we need to do.
Mr. Fellows, your answer?
Well, I think Ryan's got it wrong when he says the Ryan budget balances the budget in 10 years. What the Ryan budget actually does is it increases spending year after year from 3 to 5%. In 10 years, we're going to be spending $1.5 trillion, or on upwards more than we're spending in 2014. So it's not going to balance the budget, and that's where he's wrong. I think we're also going to have to deal with Medicare and Social Security. Obviously, those budgets and those trust funds are having problems, and they're going to go broke. And so, if we want to save something for our future generations, we're going to have to deal with those things now. Governor Gary Johnson said if former governor of New Mexico, that if the federal government had just block granted Medicaid money to him, he'd find a better way to make it work. We have 50 state innovations working on some of those things, but some of the things that I would probably get rid of are things like the Department of Education. Education is better at the local level. We've lost our footing in science and math because I think of some of these regulations like No Child Left Behind and Common Core. I think the Commerce Department is something else we could get rid of. I think even the Department of Energy, it doesn't produce any energy, and a lot of stuff that it does is also being mirrored in the Department of Defense, like in nuclear energy. And so those are three things I think we can do as well, and send that money back to the states and let them worry about education. Let the parents themselves make those choices on education.
Mr. Lewis, your response?
Well, look, step one is passing a budget. Congress should not get a pay raise until they can pass a budget. Communities, families, businesses across this country work on a budget every day. The only place that can't pass a budget is Congress. But the Ryan budget looks at the wrong places to balance the budget, including Medicare. Medicare does not add to the deficit in this country. It will starting in 2024, and we should do something about that. But let's not look first at areas that working folks, seniors in this state depend on.
Mr. Zinke, your response?
Well, the Ryan budget, again, is a framework. It's not perfect. But again, transferring over $700 billion from Medicare to Obamacare makes it insolvent in the long run. Do I think you can cut your way out of the mess we're in? No. You can cut the entirety of the Department of Defense budget, and it's not enough. It's not enough. You're going to have to grow the economy. And believe me, of the three legs between taxes, cutting, and growth has the most potential. Because in this country, when we become energy independent, when we get government out of business and remove the barricades so America can do what America does best, innovate, think out of the box. That's the strength of America. And if we allow America to do those things, our economy will grow 5.5%, and we will lead by example. I'm confident of it.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
Well, I think the system is broken. We'll never see a balanced budget in my lifetime anyway, because Congress, they don't have the willpower. They don't really want to reduce spending because they're too busy sending all that money back home in order to buy votes. And that's why you see a lot of this money in politics, because they're simply buying votes so they can give money to all these different corporations. The Farm Bill was certainly a bill of that nature, where we gave all kinds of subsidies to these rich and powerful corporations like Archer Daniels Midland Company, who didn't really need the money, but we're giving all this money away. And I think senators like Tom Coburn probably got it right that some of this stuff is too small. It's too small to cut, and the big stuff they don't want to cut because they don't want to have to go home to their constituents and have to sit in front of a public audience like this and explain their votes to their constituents.
The next question comes from Anna Rao and would go to Mr. Zinke.
Mr. Zinke, with the Iraq government under siege and extremists reconstituting in Iraq and joining forces with Syria, the Middle East is growing more unstable all the time. In light of this, do you think U.S. policy in the Middle East has been successful? And should we be doing anything differently?
Well, I happen to have a little experience in Iraq because I was the deputy acting commander of special forces in Iraq. And I think it's an unprecedented failure across the board of our foreign policy. I can't think of an example where our position is better today than it was 6 years ago, including Canada. Our enemies no longer fear us. Our allies no longer trust us. The hard facts is we will have a nuclear-armed and capable Iran by the end of the presidency. We had an opportunity in Syria to become a democracy. Iraq is imploding, and we don't have a status of forces agreement. So if our pilots or special forces were to re-enter Iraq, they could be tried as war criminals under Iraqi law and not the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Crimea Peninsula, softball pitch. We should have immediately approved the Keystone Pipeline. We should have immediately accelerated infrastructure so we could export liquid natural gas, and we should have relaxed the restrictions on sweet crude. Reagan had it right. If you want to check Soviet dominance and influence, in which Putin is Soviet, you hit him in the face with the free market. That's what America does best. Iraq, I think it's going to devolve again. The same people we fought. It will probably go into 3 semi-autonomous regions of power.
Mr. Fellows, your answer?
Well, I think foreign policy has been kind of a disaster over the years. You know, you can talk about some of the situations that President Carter had been in. You talk about some of the situations that George Bush certainly has been in. You know, Iraq was certainly a war for oil. Afghanistan, you've got so many different factions in Afghanistan. We weren't going to control it anyway, and there's never going to be a central government. I think that's going to last in Afghanistan. I'm kind of a Ron Paul supporter in that way because he wanted to get out of all these different foreign entanglements. I think it was George Washington way back when that talked about the fact that we were going to get ourselves in trouble if we kept going into these foreign entanglements. And sometimes it's the fact that we're supporting the wrong dictator. I mean, and it's all based on democracy, and that I think that's a problem because a lot of those countries they see us come in there and they don't want us in there, and for the most part, the average citizen probably doesn't want to. Of course, the rulers want to because they want the money and all the support that we're going to give them. So I think that certainly has to change. And in terms of war, it's Congress that declares war, and so we hope that Barack Obama simply follows the Constitution in that regard and notifies Congress and let them make those resolutions to declare war if we need to in the near future.
Mr. Lewis, your answer?
We need to do everything to protect the security of America. And the situation in Iraq is a serious situation. It could become a breeding ground for terrorists. And we need to support Iraq, but at the same time exhaust all diplomatic and political solutions that we can before sending troops into harm's way again on the ground. As I've traveled across Montana, I've heard consistently from folks that people want Congress and America to focus on the problems and challenges we have at home rather than nation building. And I think we should focus on fixing those problems, including the VA, the Veterans Administration, and keeping our promises to our veterans first before we send troops again into harm's way into another international conflict.
Mr. Zinke, a response?
Well, I think energy independence is a key to a great and prosperous foreign policy. I can guarantee you if America was energy independent, we wouldn't have to have 2 carrier battle groups in the Persian Gulf. My daughter's a Navy diver. My son-in-law is a Navy SEAL active duty. I don't want to see my kids and your kids fight on foreign shores for a commodity we have in North America. We could become energy independent, which we can do. It's a global game changer. It changes our strength, our power, our security, and it brings back manufacturing and domestic prosperity to this country. And we have every opportunity to do it. And it is about shale. It is about wind. It is about nuclear. It's about all the above. But you can't ignore oil and shale and gas because that's available now, and coal.
Mr. Fellows, your response?
Well, because of our foreign policy and because of this war on terror, it also has some negative consequences, I think, to the average citizens. Because of the war on terror, we now have the Patriot Act, and we think of a Section 215 in the Patriot Act that allows the federal government to collect our phone messages, to collect our email messages, to simply spy on us, even though we do have the Fourth Amendment that says that the government shouldn't be in there without unreasonable searches and seizures. They have to have a warrant. You know, we've got the National Security Administration. Just because the CIA and the FBI couldn't talk to each other, we're spending $57 billion on that agency. I think it's just it's a waste of money in those certain circumstances. And as Ben Franklin said when he talked about, we can't sacrifice security for freedom, and it's just not going to work. And so we have to get rid of the Patriot Act. We have to get rid of the NSA. We have to get rid of the things like the National Defense Authorization Act, and get back to following the Constitution, and get us out of all these foreign.
Mr. Fellows, your time is up. Mr. Lewis, your response?
I agree we need to become energy independent in this country. And that's why this week we released a conversation starter of an energy plan that calls for investing in all forms of energy, traditional forms of energy, coal, oil, gas, that we currently invest in, and other alternative forms of energy, wind, biomass, hydro. And it is about becoming energy independent and thinking about the long-term future. Long-term future. I'm not saying that some of these forms of energy are our answer to our energy needs tomorrow, but let's be visionary. Let's think about the long term and become energy independent.
Thank you. We will now move to the closing remarks. Each candidate will have 3 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, panelists, Anna, Frank, and Chuck, and thank you again, Montana Tech, for hosting this debate on campus. It's been a great experience, and enjoyed it. And I want to say that, come back to what I said in the beginning. I was blessed to be born and raised in Montana, and I want the same things for my kids, for all of our kids, that I had growing up in Montana, and that's a great education in Montana, that's good paying jobs in Montana. And I'm worried that that's in jeopardy. And it's because Congress goes from crisis to crisis, kicking the can down the road to our kids and grandkids. And I look forward to helping Montanans see that there is a clear choice in this race. And there are big contrasts. Number one, I'm somebody that's focused on solutions for working families. Solutions, working together. My mom, who's a professional facilitator, she taught me about the words compromise and cooperation. Compromise, that's a pretty good word. A much better word is cooperation, working together for the greater good, moving this state, moving this country forward. Unfortunately, what we see from the other side is just more of the same dysfunction, tired rhetoric that led to the government shutdown this fall. And people are sick and tired of it. We're all tired of it. Number two, when it comes to issues important to Montanans, you'll never have to guess where I stand on the issue. And look, when it comes to energy jobs, education, infrastructure, you'll know where I stand, rather than have multiple stances on different issues when it's politically convenient. Number three, women in this country make critical decisions for their families, for their businesses, for their communities every day. And in fact, as we talk, women are putting their lives on the line to protect the freedoms we enjoy in this country. And that's why I take issue when politicians think that they know best, know better than women when it comes to making personal health care decisions in this country. And so I am focused on solutions. And I'm going to close by saying thank you for doing this, and I humbly ask for your vote. And I look forward to tomorrow, Father's Day. I'm taking my kids to Fishing Derby that we went to last year. And I look forward to your ideas and suggestions on how we can move Montana and this country forward.
Thank you. Mr. Zinke, you have 3 minutes.
I spent 23 years as a Navy SEAL. I fought in Bosnia and Kosovo and Iraq. I was a commander at SEAL Team 6. In specific, I was a squadron commander and troop commander. I served as the acting commander of Naval Special Warfare in Bosnia and the acting commander of Special Operations Forces in Iraq. And the reason why I fought is I fought for us. I love this country. Truth. It is about truth. Ultimately, do you trust America, and do you want to trust America? I want to trust America. I want to see our country rebuilt. I want to see American exceptionalism restored. When our flag flies in foreign shores, I want other countries to respect it, to know that we're truthful, that we're honorable, that our purpose is one of dedication, commitment. When we make a promise, whether it's to our elderly or our veterans, I expect America to keep it. I expect our leadership to be held accountable. I expect you to hold me accountable. Throughout this campaign and the primary, I laid out exactly where I believe this country should go. I don't waffle on issues, because issues oftentimes aren't black and white. Issues demand reading, research, talking. In battle, if you know where you're going to end up before you go, you know what, you're a pretty lucky sailor, because things change on the field. Things change in America. We face a global economy that's dynamic. And so as we go through and make this country what it should be, as you are going to change your views on compelling information and truth. We're not going to fix this country unless we go back to truth. And the truth of the matter is we can fix it. The truth of the matter is we need to bring government back to accountability. We need to become energy independent so we're not held hostage by foreign entities. And we need to talk about truth. And if we do that, we'll win. Because the power of America is not in our government. The power of America is in the resolve of us as a people to fix it. So thank you, God bless America, and God bless those who defend her.
Thank you. Mr. Fellows, you have 3 minutes.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank the Montana Newspaper Association for inviting us here. I'd like to thank those in the audience and those watching on Montana PBS. Certainly this nation is broken. It's going to take a lot of work to get that thing fixed. We need more citizens to get involved in their government to fix it. We also need a government that is a lot smaller. We need less government. Unfortunately, the two main parties in power will not give us a less government because they've been spending so much over the years just to satisfy the rich and the well-connected, because that's all the moneyed politics are, is the power to control. You know, there's some of us that don't want the power to control. We want to protect our property rights, protect our own lives. But we need to work on restoring the Constitution. We have a lot of troubles in that area, I think. You know, they're trying to take away our gun rights. That's the right to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. We've got the Fourth Amendment that's under attack with the Patriot Act, with the NSA. And Congress, law enforcement needs a warrant when they're going to knock on somebody's door. We can't just do a blanket search. And two, the thing we can do to take our country back, I think, is getting on juries, the Sixth Amendment, trial by jury. The Founding Fathers saw juries as a check on abusive government. Juries have the right to judge the law and vote their conscience. And so when laws like the Prohibition Act that nobody really liked, it was juries that said, no, I'm not going to enforce the law. Congress had to go back and change it. And so people can get involved in the various the aspect. And of course, June 5th was the first anniversary of Edward Snowden's leak to the newspaper about abuses of the Fourth Amendment. And so maybe he should run for president. I think he makes a lot of sense. We got to protect our Fourth Amendment rights. We got to protect our privacy rights. We got to try to get money out of politics because it's controlling things too much. Even though at times money doesn't make any difference, but I will get rid of crony capitalism in Washington, D.C. It's causing a lot of problems in this country. I will vote for a smaller, less government. I will vote to protect our Second Amendment rights. I will vote to protect states' rights as well. Montana passed medical marijuana, but a lot of those in Congress say, well, we don't care about Montana. We think the government should control what we do with our own persons and what medicines we decide to take. And so that's something that we need to change. You can catch me on the website at votefellows.org or catch me on my Facebook page at Mike Fellows for Montana. And I appreciate your vote come November.
Well, that concludes the debate of the U.S. House candidates. I want to thank the candidates, John Lewis, Ryan Zinke, and Mike Fellows, for their honest answers. I want to thank our panelists, Chuck Johnson, Anna Rao, and Frank Mealy. Especially want to thank the production crew from Montana PBS for their professional assistance, our timers, Bina Egensberger and Melody Martinson, for keeping us on track. And I want to thank the Montana Newspaper Association and Montana PBS for sponsoring this debate. And of course, I want to thank you, the viewers, for tuning in. This has been a wonderful opportunity to maybe advance our knowledge and make a better informed decision when we vote. So from Montana Tech, that's a wrap.
This Montana PBS presentation of the Montana Newspaper Association Candidate Debates was brought to you in part by the Greater Montana Foundation, encouraging communications on issues, trends, and values of importance to Montanans, and the Montana Newspaper Foundation.